Welcome to this subscriber-based video. We thank you for your contribution to its cost, which is paid to the NAPE National Office for either £15 or £10 for members. Now, compassion-focused education is the subject of the video. This is a recorded workshop session which was carried out at the conference in 2024. Thank you.
If I may, I'll make a start, and thank you for choosing the workshop. That's what I was going to say to the audience to start with. And I'd like to extend my thanks to NAPE for the invitation today as well, Peter. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk this morning. So I'm going to sort of focus a little bit around children's experience of vulnerability in education and what that means really in terms of their particular context and so on. And as we move through this morning's workshop, I'm going to be thinking about ways that compassion might inform our experience in education. My doctoral research was very much around the emotional work that teachers can experience in schools, and particularly the emotional work that can be experienced when they're supporting children that might exhibit high levels of distress. And so Janet this morning's talked about, as you know, the four broad areas of need: cognition and learning, communication, interaction, physical and sensory needs, and the category I'm most interested in my professional career is related to is social, emotional and mental health needs. So I started work in a primary school. I developed a particular interest in supporting children with more sort of complex profiles around their mental health. And so for the remainder of my career, I've actually worked in specialist provision. So independent special school for children with complex learning needs, communication difficulties and challenging behaviours, whatever that might be. And I've also been lucky enough to work in a residential therapeutic school as well for children that experience significant early trauma. I now work at Oxford Brookes University and I lead the MA in special education. I'm a research fellow for the Children and Young People's Network, and I also do a bit of work with undergrads and in initial teacher education. So that's a bit about my kind of context. I'm going to introduce a sensitivity warning because we might be talking about, experiences that relate to wellbeing that have a sensitive nature. We're going to be thinking a bit this morning about some of the relevance of some compassion-focused therapeutic ideas, promoting this idea about compassion-focused education, which is something my doctoral research arrived at. And if you're on social media, I've got the hashtag #CompassionEdRevolution. I think there should be more compassion in education. So we're going to start by looking at the context of concerns, start thinking about the impact of children's experiences on their mental health and well-being, also to think about our own well-being and mental health as teachers, and then to think together about how we might create more compassionate school communities together. So that's the kind of focus. But had we been in a larger group, I would have encouraged you to talk to the person next to you. And just thinking now for a minute or two, when it was that you last showed compassion to somebody, and thinking about, where were you? And why did you feel the need to show some compassion, and how did you share that compassion, and how did it make you feel? So I was just thinking about an experience yesterday, actually. A colleague of mine is undergoing treatment for cancer presently. And so we met yesterday, and he'd just come out of his 4th day of radiotherapy. And it's very early in his treatment. So, and I think really I empathise with the experience. I've had cancer previously, and I just gave him time to talk. I think that's what he needed at the time. He just had the opportunity to talk about his experiences and how he was feeling. So that's, I think, really important. This quote here is Professor Barry Carpenter. You might be familiar with Barry's work around SEN and complex learning needs. He's got books around Gilded autism, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, complex learning needs, and so on. And this is very much pre-pandemic. 2017 was already beginning to identify a generation of children with complex learning needs associated with vulnerability, and particularly vulnerability around their emotional development. And he suggests that these vulnerable learners are fragile, and as educators, our quest should be, how do we make these children emotionally strong. And I find this quotation quite interesting as well to reflect on current circumstances. And I think that's really important to recognise about the children and young people we're working with in our schools today, particularly around, who their sense of self and that being socially constructed within this specific socio-cultural environment at a specific time. That sort of impact of global pandemic or adversity around sort of destitution and poverty that we're seeing in the UK at the moment. It's quite frightening, really, in terms of the number of children that are living in quite extreme levels of deprivation and so on. And I quite like a sort of biopsychosocial way of looking at, if we would say, for example, autism, ADHD, any of the special education needs that you might be working that have a more neurological basis. Actually, what's very, depending on their educational experiences and things like, family circumstances, the school context, the ethos and culture, the knowledge and understanding of the children, and the particular types of needs and so on, can have an impact either positively or negatively on their self-esteem or their self-efficacy. I've worked with children in special schools that arrive feeling like complete failures. They've been excluded from a number of different provisions. They've been very successful at failure, essentially. And part of our role in these contexts is to try and give them experience of success to help develop their kind of self-efficacy and their self-belief and so on. And I'm always surprised at the kind of children that end up in special schools, because actually they're often, and these are children with challenging behaviour, very caring, sensitive young people, that actually, can do very well. And I often think, I wonder why they ended up in a sort of specialist provision. And that was really important to listen to as well, the final concluding part of the talk this morning about the fact that the government are now investing in more specialist schools. So rather than the sort of move towards inclusion, which has been happening for a long time now, there seems to be more alternative provisions being set up, more special schools being set up. And these children, when we look at the exclusion rate shortly, are being moved away from the educational system. So we've already had some professional sharing actually around levels of anxiety and issues around attachment and so on in the classroom that you're seeing having an impact on the children's experiences in the classroom. And I think a lot of that is important to recognise around the context of, for example, poverty and deprivation, cost of living crisis. This was in January 2023 from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. 3.9 million children living in poverty. And then more recently, February 2024, that number's increased to 5.2 million children living in poverty. 70% of children in poverty live in a household where at least one adult is working, in fact, actually. 43% of children with two or more siblings living in poverty. And this whole concept now around destitution, the number of children actually living in destitution has risen threefold. Now, there's other really important and interesting stats on there, particularly around the number of children entering the care system, for example, the number of children and requests for education, health and care plans, children in need, child protection inquiries. They're all kind of related to the current context that our children are experiencing presently. So, I mentioned there about the number of children entering the care system. So there's actually more children going into care and less than being ceasing to be looked after. So the numbers of children experiencing adversity in early childhood and so on are increasing. And the most sort of prevalent age for children going into care is around 14. In fact, it's not sort of very young children. These stats are interesting. Do you ever check out the exclusion statistics in England? No. So I wouldn't expect you to. But this is one term. This is the spring term. 263,904 suspensions. These are the old fixed-term exclusions. 3,039 permanent exclusions. A permanent exclusion is when a child is removed from a school role and can no longer return back to that school. And I've been concerned about the number of exclusions for a number of years now. If you put DFE exclusion statistics, you can find these over the last 12 years, and the numbers are just increasing over time. They dropped slightly during COVID, but how can they exclude children when they're at home? Turn the laptop off. I don't know. But if you look at the sort of UK-wide comparisons, which colleagues at Oxford are doing with the Excluded Lives project, there's very distinct differences between the English policy context, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. So these are the temporary exclusions. This is now, I mean, obviously geographically a smaller country, but this is the whole year, only 11,000 suspensions and only one permanent exclusion. So 3,000 in England in one term, in the spring term, and only one in Scotland in the whole year. So that's interesting. It does reflect a change in the policy landscape. So I think there is definitely something around the policy context, and this is again just from the national picture in Scotland. 99% of exclusions were for a fixed period of time, and the children then return to their school, their original school. Only one was removed from the register, and like England, that child is then not allowed to return to school. Now, this is from the Education Policy Institute. Only this month they've released some figures about exclusion in primary school, and in year 6 in 2009, 2.6% of pupils were suspended. It's not the permanent exclusion, but what they were looking at is what happens to these children afterwards. And on average, you might actually assume that suspended pupils from primary school left having not met the expected standard in reading and maths, but also on average were 10 months behind their non-suspended peers. So taking account of other factors, demographic, economic and so on, prior attendance, school characteristics, which may explain the differences, these negative effects were statistically significant still. So there is a relationship between being excluded and then, you know, poor outcomes, and that's the same for secondary as well. I mean, in terms of the stats, most exclusions happen in secondary school, and again, mostly around the age of 14. And it's boys more than girls, and so on. But I think, and it's certainly to do with, there are certain types of school that exclude more children. So some of the bigger academy chains, I think it's 3 of the largest academies skew the exclusion stats. And I think it's to do with, as was recognised this morning, a sort of performative culture. I mean, there's a school in Oxfordshire that was in the news a couple of years ago that lost 25% of its GCSE cohort just before GCSE. So I think there is a bit of gaming in the system around who's more likely to be excluded and for what reason. I mean, then a sort of concern you've begun to identify is the sort of mental health needs of children and young people and the increases around prevalence. So actually it's quite a large proportion of primary school pupils, again mostly boys at that level, that can be identified with a probable mental health disorder. And the gender balance then sort of levels out in lower secondary, but then by upper secondary, girls are significantly more likely to be identified with mental health needs. They're usually internalised types of need like eating disorders, self-harm, and so on. And the boys are more, what do you think boys are more likely to be associated with when they're younger in terms of mental health needs? Yeah, it's like, well actually the actual NHS digital publication does capture young children, it doesn't feature here. But in terms of boys' presentation of their difficulties, how do they present, do you think?
Aggressive?
Yeah.
Aggression.
So in terms of diagnosis, usually things like conduct disorders or oppositional stuff, and girls are different in that sense. But you can see over time the sort of number of needs increasing from 2017 pre-pandemic and sort of beyond really. And children who are affected by mental health needs are least likely to say they've got a friend they can talk to in school, and least likely to say they feel safe in school, or least likely to be themselves at school or to enjoy learning. So these kind of emotional needs that were identified earlier have an impact then on their kind of feelings of belonging, connection, and all that kind of stuff in a school context. Oxwell is it's a project undertaken by Oxford University's Department of Psychiatry and NHS and so on. But there's some really interesting stats there about children's mental health if you would like to look at that another time. So we talked a little bit about when we show compassion. When was the last time somebody showed you compassion? When was the last time you experienced compassion from another? And again, it's just maybe an opportunity to reflect on an experience where were you? Who showed you compassion? How? And how did that make you feel? It's really important to reckon, this is Catherine Weir, that wellbeing in schools starts if staff are feeling cared for and not burnt out. I'm sorry about the stats I'm about to share now about teachers' wellbeing. But this is the Teacher Wellbeing Index, and it's quite frightening, really, around the number of teachers that experience stress in school and feel that their culture, organisational cultures, have a negative impact on their wellbeing. These 81% of staff had symptoms that were associated with mental health needs and experiencing anxiety or have experienced a mental health issue in the past academic year. And that was something my doctoral research was really interested in kind of exploring in these different special school contexts. So if you think about some of your children arriving in the morning, where would you say they might be on this sort of scale of concern? The current behaviour guidance behaviour in schools is very much around compliance and control, really. I mean, it's been updated recently, slightly different to behaviour and discipline in schools, but there's very little notice in the policy around recognition and reward. It's mostly hierarchy of consequences and so on. I think that affects teachers and children, really, in terms of how they're feeling about school. And I quite like this quotation here. This is Jonathan Glazard and Stone. He was talking about reconceptualising the role of teachers and whether it's a step too far that teachers then should be responsible for supporting children's mental health. You can't avoid the fact that you're going to be working with children with experience of emotional distress, but schools, he suggests, that I love this, in a really paradoxical situation, they're required to support children's mental health at the same time as subjecting young people to pedagogical approaches which have an adverse effect on them. So they're often doing things that they know are going to have a negative impact on the children they're working with, and that's quite concerning. When we look at the language of policy for children with additional needs, and particularly those around the SMH category, it's all deficit focused. It's all about problems, difficulties, and disorders. Whereas, things like the neurodiversity movement is very much around thinking about individuals' capabilities, their strengths. And this is part of the problem with the SEN system at the moment, that you have to identify the difficulties to get support, but then you're only focusing on the children's problems rather than what they're good at, what they're capable of. And so I think that's interesting as well, around the sort of language and so on. So my doctoral research was very much around the emotional work of teachers, because we're involved in lots of relationships and they are happening all the time, aren't they, with your class? You can't predict what they're going to do, can you? I'm sure. From the minute they get in the morning to whatever time you go home, you're constantly monitoring what's happening in the classroom. You're seeing that relationship or that relationship, and you've got to teach as well, of course. You've got all that stuff going on as well. And we can experience quite a lot of emotions in our day that are quite complex, I think. Some are positive. When we see children succeed, or they're nice to their friends, or that's really nice. It's really, has a good impact on us. But there are other things that can have a negative impact on our well-being, I think, actually. Particularly if we do think about our children. We're worried about our children, all that sort of stuff. And if we're working with children that also exhibit heightened emotions and behaviour, we've got some really complex social and emotional experiences that we're trying to navigate. In my special school, I only had 8 children in a class, but they were there for their challenging behaviour. And they learnt in different ways, they communicated in different ways, they didn't always get on well together, they didn't always get on well with the teacher, they could be quite aggressive at times and so on. But I think what you were saying, Peter, is a different part of our job. There's the physical aspect. I bet you were physically exhausted after the school trip because you're with them and walking around. You've probably done all the planning and preparation, all that sort of stuff before you got there. But this is a different type of work, I think. This emotional work involves the emotional experiences, and it's thinking about how our behaviour might impact on others. For example, if we offer to console a child in this particular way, is it going to work? It might work for that, but you've already shared about 5 examples where that one needs that support, and that one needs that support, and that one needs that support. So we're thinking about our impact on our behaviour on others, but also on their behaviour on each other and all that sort of stuff. And you've mentioned a number of social interactions there, didn't you, with children, parents and carers, colleagues. They're all complicated relational experiences, aren't they, I think, actually. And of course we're caring and we're enthusiastic and we're sensitive because we want our children to feel safe and comfortable. But there are times where we do feel anxious, or we might even feel irritated, or sometimes we might feel angry. These are difficult emotions that we all feel at times, but it's not appropriate to share those often in the classroom. So we have to hide those feelings, and that's, again, emotional work. It's, we hear about masking and so on around autism, but actually I think teachers are good actors, often aren't they? I mean, they're often very good performers anyway, but they're sometimes hiding their true emotions, I think. So we've got to regulate our own emotions and feelings and behaviour because of what's acceptable in a given situation or environment. So often we might express our emotions if they're deemed to be appropriate, but we'll often not express them. And what do we do with those emotions? How do schools help us with the emotional aspects of our work? As part of my interviews, one of the teachers said, doing a one-to-one interview, it's quite a private space. But she talked about her own vulnerabilities of sharing her feelings with others. She was a new head teacher to this particular school, but did have supervision often, and that is where you could talk about, this child, and how they are is really affecting me, and how are you coping with it, or what kind of support can we offer each other. But she was a new head and she'd never had supervision before, and she found it really, she talked about her own vulnerability there of sharing her feelings in front of her colleagues. But I think over time you kind of get used to it. They're very good at talking about how they look after other people. They talk less about how other people look after them, and they talk even less about how they look after themselves. I thought that was really interesting. And that's literally the stats that came out of my doctoral research. So there's the sort of notion of compassion. You were talking about the organisational culture in a school, or how colleagues look out for each other and check in, to see how people are doing and so on. That's culture, really. Compassionate responses to behaviour I'm particularly interested in, being sensitive to the stress that children experience. Lots of ways that are already out there. I mean, I really liked using Neil's values-based education previously. I also really like the SEAL, social and emotional aspects of learning stuff. I was a teacher then when we had the national strategies, and I love the SEAL stuff. But all that seems to have been lost, hasn't it? Compassionate responses to behaviour I'm particularly interested in, being sensitive to the stress that children experience. Because what we're usually seeing with the children's behaviour, but when we are seeing behaviour, of course, it's always the tip of the iceberg. Really good in terms of supporting children who've experienced adversity and trauma. I don't know why it is that we have to kind of promote the idea of relational approaches in schools, but Oxfordshire local authority, through their virtual schools and resources, I'm sure you've heard of attachment aware, trauma informed, nurture group approach, emotional coaching. This is how compassion, I think, can and does come into the curriculum. We need to start with compassionate principles, and that's about care for self and others. It's about connection. It's about awareness of each other and their emotions. It's being and engaging in things that are actually helpful and healthy in schools. To interact, one of the phrases that I really liked from my doctorate is that actually teachers felt that others cared for them. They had care and concern about them. They felt thought about and cared for them. That they amplify what's already happening and doing more of it. But this is tricky for leadership, I think, but filtering out things that can have a negative impact on wellbeing. Actually take professional action to prevent or inhibit any experience that's going to cause distress in others and ourselves. That's what the compassion can. And I think teachers need much more support. This is the difficulty with these academic chains. I don't know how they're getting their support, and when it comes to supervision, it might be that the head gets it and the school staff don't. I think heads should get it, but I think teachers should as well. I really like this quotation here. This is Professor Paul Gilbert. Biggest enemy of compassion is conformity. So a preparedness to go along with the way things are, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of complacency, sometimes because we do what our leaders tell us to do. So, teachers, we need more compassionate non-conformity, I think. That's my take home for today. Yeah, so, thank you very much for your engagement. A couple of books that I've contributed chapters to, and that's my doctoral research. And I'll just tell you now, I'm very proud. It's had the most hits in the Oxford Brookes University thesis library. And I don't think they're all me. But thank you very much for coming this morning. And I've really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that.